Good morning. I remember in January 1986 watching the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger, and then just a few moments later it exploding tragically. And that was quite an event. For those not familiar with that particular space shuttle had the very first participant in NASA's Teacher in Space program, Krista McAuliffe. And so as part of that, the nation, it seemed like, encouraged all children who were able to watch this grand event. And then in that moment, that tragic moment, all these children watched 7 astronauts pass away, unexpectedly, obviously. On that same night, President Ronald Reagan was scheduled to provide his State of the Union address. It's something that our nation has done for a long time, late in January. Well, that night he decided to do something a little bit different and pay homage to those astronauts. And Ronald Reagan, I think being an actor and things, was really good at understanding the audience and connecting to the audience. And in the midst of his speech that night, he spoke to the children and he said, "I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's part of the process of exploration and discovery." It's part of the process. Just a few days later, he was asked to speak to the memorial for all the astronauts. One of those astronauts was Dick Scobie. And in this speech, President Reagan said, "Dick Scobie knew that every launching of a space shuttle is a technological marvel. And he said, if something ever does go wrong, I hope that doesn't mean the end of the space shuttle program." President Reagan goes on to say, "Every family member I talk to asked specifically that we continue the space shuttle program. That is what their departed loved one would want above all else." And he goes on to say, "We will not disappoint them. Today we promise Dick Scobie and his crew that their dream lives on, that the future they worked so hard to build will become reality." In some ways, I think President Reagan was maybe not just eulogizing some folks, but maybe even following a pattern that Luke laid out in his writing of Acts. It's already been covered in our studies in Acts that Luke was writing this as a response to being commissioned by Theophilus. And when I read this particular chapter 7, which has quite a number of verses in it, I read through and I see more than just a record of one of history's many battles between Christians and their opposition. I think Luke wanted to do that for Theophilus, give him the historical record. But I see Luke masterfully recognizing that the audience was far greater than Theophilus. And he's writing to Christians and those who maybe are searching for the truth, those who need to find the truth, and those who are wanting to find the truth. And I see a leader's powerful message encouraging Christians to keep carrying out the Great Commission that's found at the end of Matthew chapter 28. But I also see Luke reaching out to Stephen's family. And I've probably read this chapter, I don't know how many times, but a lot of times. And I've read it a lot since I was assigned this particular study. But it wasn't until I was assigned this study that I read this chapter and I took a moment to think about Stephen's family. And we're going to spend some time on that today because I think Luke did a great job offering a heartfelt and inspiring eulogy of a courageous man. It's both timely words that were treasured by his grieving family to keep going, and timeless words that continue to inspire Christians even today who have kept going and going and going. When you look at the purpose of Acts, it's to explain the establishment and the growth of the Church of Christ. And Luke, as I've observed as we go on through our studies, now we're into chapter 7, Luke uses a writing style that to me highlights certain persons and their impact. I think that's really important and powerful. He says this is how you build something. It's through people. It's through people making conscious choices to do things or to not do things. And there are consequences and rewards of the choices that they make. And even though he provides all the contextual information that you need in each of these settings, he makes sure that you know this person made a difference in this moment, or this group of men made a difference in this moment. He puts a spotlight on them. And these are the people of emphasis. And now, in chapter 6, Luke signaled that he was about to put a spotlight on both Stephen and Philip. And Philip will come in chapter 8. But here's the moment that Stephen is in view for us. And today, I want to go through these verses and I want to look at 5 different areas. I want to look at the men that Stephen addressed as he gave this speech, his defense. I want to look at the message that he provides. And we'll do our best to kind of move through that with a little bit of detail, but maybe not too much detail for the interest of time. I want to take a moment to look at the moment that is not found in the Scriptures. And then I want to take a little bit of time towards the end to speak a little bit to the murder of Stephen and his martyrdom as well. So let's begin by focusing on the men. You know, if you read many translations, it just simply mentions brethren and fathers, but I want to read from, the opening of chapter 7, the King James Version. So I think the King James Version actually is a better reflection of the original language in my studies. It says there, "Then said the high priest, 'Are these things so?' And Stephen said, 'Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken.'" Or men, brethren, and fathers, listened. So the high priest here would have been Caiaphas. This is the same man who oversaw the trial of Jesus, the same man that oversaw Peter and John in Acts chapter 5. And now we find him for the 3rd time presiding over some kind of examination of those who are trying to live the life of Christians, or to in the case of Jesus, present the Christian dispensation of time. Caiaphas and other leaders would have orchestrated the false witnesses that are referenced in chapter 6. And so when he asks this question, he knows the answer. And he has an idea what the answer should be. But there's one thing he doesn't know. He has no idea how Stephen is going to answer it. And I suspect that Caiaphas realizes immediately that he's in for quite a speech from Stephen. Because Stephen doesn't just kind of start answering the question. He makes a point, he does exactly as Luke kind of has provided, and I think Luke would have already known this. He says, let me make sure that everyone knows who I'm talking to today. So we've got some imagery here. The Sanhedrin would have met in the temple area, and they would have met off in kind of a small room, a very private room, on one of the exterior walls. And it's meant to demonstrate that there. The Sanhedrin was made up of 70 men, and you can see illustrated here 35 on each side of the high priest, and the high priest would be the tie-breaking vote to the extent there was ever a 35-35 tie. And then there were a couple of scribes who would record the events, the minutes and things, and you see those kind of there. Most people believe these were always very private sessions. There really wasn't anyone who was able to watch those like maybe some of the trials in our modern society today. Well, Stephen, I think, probably surprised Caiaphas when he addressed the council in 3 different groups. And maybe kind of shows Caiaphas that he knows something that maybe Caiaphas knows as well. He says, first of all, brothers or men. And these are just kind of the general members of the council. These are the people who had worked really hard to get to the status that they were. So the Sanhedrin took a lot of effort and time and energy. You weren't young and on this. You had to have these progressive and advancing skills. You had to maybe know a lot of languages. You had to have a lot of experience, good decision making, wisdom, a person of reputation, and all that. You might have served in the lesser Sanhedrin, and then you make it into the upper Sanhedrin. And maybe you're sitting on that back wall, and then you get to the middle row, and then you get to the front row, and then you move all the way over next to the high priest. And so there would have been a lot of these men who are just that. They've worked their way up, and they're continuing to work their way up, and frankly, they would have struggled for anyone to come in and say, this doesn't apply anymore. And all of these things you've worked for are now irrelevant because the Messiah has come. And so he just speaks to them and he says, I want you to hear the story I'm about to tell. And then the second group he speaks to is brethren. And so we find in the scriptures that there were people who sat on this council who secretly believed in Jesus, secretly served Jesus, and these were secret Christians. And he says to them, I want you to not just hear the story because you know the story, you believe in it. I want you to see how I share that story respectfully, courageously, and fully to the end. And then fathers is the third group that he speaks to. This would be Caiaphas and his little inner circle sitting there next to them. You know what I think he tells them? Because it would have always worked exactly like you see in this image. The witness would have stood right in front of the high priest. You're right there. He tells him, you're my last priority today. That's why I'm referencing you last. My first priority is God. My first priority is sharing the truth to convert others. And my first priority is to help those who maybe are struggling to do it openly and publicly. And you, men of great reputation, are my last priority today. So in Acts chapter 6, we find Stephen is charged for blasphemy against God, Moses, the law, and the temple. And here he stands before the council and he provides his defense as Caiaphas has asked him. You know, there's a few observations that I want to make before we start reading this, and we'll read this in 4 sections, I believe. When Jesus was questioned by the council, he had very little to say. Hardly anything. And I think Caiaphas maybe expected more of the same from Stephen. And Stephen gave him a lot more than very little. He gave him a lot. The other thing is these are really educated experts, super knowledgeable on the law. The Sanhedrin, even though they were misguided and stuff, they knew a lot. They knew a lot about the law, and they knew it in many different languages. Stephen, we find in chapter 6, had this miraculous understanding of God's plan and His will and all of the history, and was able to teach it with great energy and zeal and to share it. But yet Stephen doesn't launch off into a bunch of complicated things, come up with the most complicated, complex thing to break down and decipher and all that. It's just very simple. If you were to run this through a translator, most translations would say this is kind of like middle school reading. This isn't super complicated stuff. And he doesn't launch off into a lot of things in the Old Testament. He just launches off in a few things. He doesn't get into a lot of complicated prophecy or things like that. And these guys would have understood all of that. He just focuses on very simple, direct things because that's what he wanted his audience to know is most important. And obviously it was very important for him to defend himself. So let's pick up in Acts, and we're going to read through Acts chapter 7, and we'll read through verse 16. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran, and said to him, "Get out of your country and from your relatives, and come to a land that I will show you." Then he came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran. And from there, when his father was dead, he moved him to this land in which you now dwell. And God gave him no inheritance in it, not even enough to set his foot on. But even when Abraham had no child, he promised to give it to him for a possession and to his descendants after him. But God spoke in this way: that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and that they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision, and so Abraham begot Isaac, and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him and delivered him out of all his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. So Jacob went down to Egypt, and he died, he and our fathers, and they were carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham bought for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem. And so here, Stephen is defending his blasphemy, supposed or alleged blasphemy of God. In preparation for this study, I've read through several commentaries. Some of you recommended them, even as recent as just a few days ago, and stuff. And it was really good to read through some of those. You know what I found is many of those commentaries tended to focus on phrases and details. And I think that's really important and valuable, and I found a lot of utility out of it. But I think many of them missed the big picture, perhaps. And what you'll find is there's a lot of supposed issues with what Stephen is saying here at different points in time. Like he says, 400 years they were in bondage in Egypt. And I think if you go and look and do the math in the Old Testament, it's actually 430 and things. You know, if I went to Starbucks, I enjoy getting coffee, and I wanted to get a coffee, and the lady there would say, you know, hey, it's $2.86 or whatever. Then I would pay $2.86. And then I walk out and someone says, that's a good looking cup of coffee. How much did that cost? $3. Which is right? Which is wrong? You know, in the world of accounting, which I have some familiarity with, there's times that you play right of the decimal, and there's times you play kind of left of the decimal or even left of commas and stuff. The truth is they're both right. So Stephen's not interested in passing an exam here. He's just interested in making certain points that need to land with these leaders. That first of all, there's no basis on the things he's been charged with. And second of all, there is a basis for what he's building to in his message here. And so one of his goals is to show reverence towards the history and the institution of the Jews. That's going to allow him to connect with these men. He says, if you want to charge me, first of all, I'm going to show you how I am just like you, at least in the role that you supposedly hold out publicly. And this allows him to establish common ground with the council before he reveals the obvious differences between him and the council leaders. So he begins here by speaking about Abraham. He doesn't go back to the beginning of time. He doesn't speak about the flood and the creation and all of that and everything. He starts with the patriarchs, the fathers of Israel. And Stephen calls Abraham our father. And sometimes you can say a lot with one word. And right there he says, listen, I look at Abraham the same way you should be looking at Abraham. He was an agent of God, a messenger of God. And we see some indication here that maybe a lot of what the Sanhedrin was teaching and preaching and trying to hold up as traditions is this temple is what's really important. And this is where people exist to serve God, and it has to be in Jerusalem. And it can't be anywhere else. And of course, Stephen was probably saying, nope, it's going to be somewhere else. Because we saw in the beginning of Acts, it's going to start in Jerusalem, but it's going to go everywhere. And it did go everywhere, and that's why we're standing and sitting where we are today. But they wanted to hold on to that. No, we have special privileges, and this is a special place. And so Stephen starts with our father Abraham, and he describes God's promise, and he begins to kind of paint a picture of how the Christian life parallels Abraham's life at the very beginning of this presentation. He says Abraham was told to relocate from his country and his relatives. And this is somewhat implied if you go back to Genesis chapter 11. But it's not real clear. And so we see an indication here that Stephen actually has maybe some insights that these other men don't have, or at least isn't found in the biblical record that we see today. And the reason is that Abraham's family needed to move was to escape an idolatrous community and a lifestyle that's referenced in Joshua 24 and verse 2. We find in Genesis 12 that God provided this covenant to Abraham, and for those who have been here a while and been able to sit through a number of studies, we've covered this in great detail. Some of Matt Trent's studies on the story of the Bible. This covenant with Abraham, which was marked with circumcision, was that there would be this great land that God's people, the descendants of Abraham, would inherit. That's Canaan here on earth. For Christians, it's heaven. There would be this great nation. That would be the children of Israel, the Israelites. Or for us, the Christian nation. And then there would be this seed, and that would be Jesus. And all things, all promises would come through Jesus. God tells Abraham, you're going to have this time in Egypt, and it's going to be an era of oppression by a people. And Stephen goes on to express that God will judge him harshly for harm done to God's people. He's no doubt referencing the 10 plagues there. The Red Sea as the waters are departed, and then when the children of Israel get to the other side and the waters flood black, all of those Egyptian soldiers and pursuers died. I'm usually not very animated, and that may work against me today. We'll see. Then God's nation will be freed and will enter the promised land to serve God, and the conquering of Canaan in the book of Joshua. And God required male circumcision, and that male circumcision would serve as the mark for those who were recipients of God's promise. And then Abraham passed on this promise to Isaac, who passed it on to Jacob, who then passed it on and on and on. You know, there's an illustration here for the Christian life as well. This earth is not the home of God's people. It's a foreign land because our citizenship is in heaven. We too will suffer and will be oppressed by others whom God will judge harshly. We are identified by things like our words, our clothing, our hair, our discipline. Meaning when people see us, they see something that signifies God. We pass on the gospel through the Great Commission we have received. And even though we don't pass on some of these Old Testament practices because those were nailed to the cross, we do pass on the teaching of Jesus. And then Stephen continues on. And he continues with Jacob. And because of common knowledge, he omits the important detail of Jacob being renamed Israel in Genesis 32 and verse 28. Which then is why all of the people are called Israelites, or the children of Israel. Jacob was the earthly father to the Israelite nation through his sons who would be the patriarchs to the 12 tribes. And Stephen highlights Joseph, whom God elevated above his brothers that we see in Genesis chapter 37. And it begins Stephen's revelation to the council how the Israelites resisted leaders that God sent to them. And Joseph explains God's plan for his life. Despite being the youngest, God would raise him above his brothers. And Joseph's envious brothers sold him to slavery in Egypt, yet God blessed Joseph in this foreign land. He interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, he rose to be governor, and provided wise and visionary leadership. And God blessed him in many ways. There was this great famine that led Jacob and his sons to Egypt, where Joseph had stored up and controlled the distribution of grain. And Joseph invited his father and all his relatives to dwell in Egypt. When I look at this particular passage of what Stephen is trying to land with the people, the key takeaway is that God was active and with his people in Mesopotamia in Haran, Canaan, and Egypt. Wherever his people went, God was with them. And when they were faithful and they followed him, even when it was maybe a bit unexpected, God was with those leaders, and he expected the people to obey and follow those leaders. So now we're going to move on and we're going to read Acts chapter 7. We'll pick up in verse 17 and read through verse 29. But when the time of the promise drew near which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt till another king arose who did not know Joseph. This man dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our forefathers, making them expose their babies so that they might not live. At this time Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God. And he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. And the next day he appeared to 2 of them as they were fighting, and tried to reconcile them, saying, Men, you are brethren, why do you wrong one another? But he who did his neighbor wrong pushed him away, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? Then at this saying Moses fled and became a dweller in the land of Midian, where he had 2 sons. Now we get into the defense of Stephen, where he was supposedly blaspheming Moses and trying to say that Moses was not one of the great forefathers to God's faithful people. And again, he repeats this pronoun, our. He describes our people and our forefathers. And we start to see God's promise of the great nation taking shape as the Israelite nation expanded from 70 or 75 people to presumably millions of people. And the Egyptian leadership, importantly, had transitioned to a king who didn't care for Joseph. That's what the original language means there. He knew who Joseph was, just didn't really care for him, what his objectives were and all of that. And he felt he's threatened by this populous nation, so the king commanded all the baby boys to be killed. Yet once again, God provided his people a leader out of a very unique circumstance. Moses was deceptively spared, and he was even raised by Pharaoh's daughter. So this guy maybe wasn't as smart as he maybe claimed to be. And during Moses' first 40 years, he grew to be distinguished among the Egyptians. And we don't talk about it a lot, but he did a lot of things for the Egyptian nation to get that reputation and respect. And so he was well known for his accomplishments among these people. But then we see in this, in Stephen's speech, he points back to the story of Moses, and he says that it came in his heart to visit. What that means is he wasn't just kind of curious, I wonder what's going on out there today. It was over his 40 years and over his adult life, he began to realize and recognize that he was a Hebrew. He was like these men. And visit has the connotation of hospitality. When someone needs you most, you go to visit. And you don't go to just kind of see what's going on. You're going to help. That's what Moses was doing here. He was going to help. And that's what the language means that Stephen is using here. And yet, with the Hebrews rejected Moses. And even though they were in this oppressive bondage, they failed to respond to Moses' God-ordained actions to deliver them from bondage. They even questioned Moses' God-given authority. And so Moses skips town. He leaves and he goes to Midian. He goes completely to the other side of the Red Sea. And he's there for 40 years. And just as Stephen was accused of blaspheming Moses in Acts chapter 6, I think the key takeaway in this particular section of his message is, in his defense, is he reverently recites the history of Moses. And he elevates him over, or more closely, to God. He shows a man who had instruction from God and then tried to do what God instructed him to do. But there's this growing inference that just as the Israelites rejected God's leader in Moses' day, the Sanhedrin were rejecting God's leaders today. And so now we're going to continue on, and we'll pick up reading in verse 30. And when 40 years had passed, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in a bush in the wilderness of Mount Sinai. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he drew near to observe, the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses trembled and dared not look. Then the Lord said to him, Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their groaning, and have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt. This Moses whom they rejected, saying, Who made you a ruler and a judge? Is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He brought them out, and after he had shown wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses who said to the children of Israel, The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear. This is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him on Mount Sinai. And with our fathers, the one who received the living oracles to give us, whom our fathers would not obey but rejected. And in their hearts they turned back to Egypt, saying to Aaron, Make us gods to go before us. As for this Moses, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, offered sacrifices to the idol, and rejoiced in the works of their own hands. Then God turned and gave them up to worship the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, Did you offer me slaughtered animals and sacrifices during 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You also took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god Remphan, images which you made to worship, and I will carry you away beyond Babylon. So now Stephen draws his attention to defending the accusation that he is blaspheming or trying to counter God's law. And so this section has an emphasis on that with the setting of the wilderness. In Exodus chapter 2, we find the revelation there that the Pharaoh from whom Moses had fled had died. And this is the opportunity in the fullness of time where God instructs Moses, now is the time for you to go back. And Stephen begins to draw these kind of very vivid and visual comparisons between Moses and Jesus. He starts by saying they're the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says that he's also the God of Moses. And it's Moses that will bring forward that law, so therefore it must be the law of God. And he says, I am with you. Stephen is saying, God told Moses, I am with you. And when you are with me, you are holy. Whether it's by this bush that you can't comprehend how that's working, or when you're before the Egyptian leaders shortly, when you're carrying leading the Hebrew people out of Egypt, I will be with you. When you carry my law, I will be with you, and we will be holy together. So God's people needed deliverance, and God would send Moses to be their deliverer, just like he sent Jesus to be the deliverer. In verses 35 through 38, Stephen has this repetitive technique of this man. He says in verse 35, this man was rejected 40 years earlier. This man showed miracles in Egypt, the Red Sea, the wilderness, and then brought them to the promised land. This man preached God will raise up a prophet whom you should hear. And that's a reference to Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 18. In verse 38, he said, this man received the law of God while others rebelled against God. This man Moses points toward and represents the many parallels to Christ as our Savior, God's chosen Redeemer, rejected by many. who turned back to Egypt. So God turned away from them, and He allowed them to engage in astrological worship, knowing punishment would await them. We can read about that in Amos 5 that Stephen is referencing here. And the key takeaway from this section is, those who did not keep the law were punished. And then finally, we're going to pick up in verse 44 through 50. Our fathers had the tabernacle of witness in the wilderness, and He appointed instructing Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen, which our fathers, having received it in turn, also brought with Joshua into the land possessed by the Gentiles, whom God drove out before the face of our fathers until the days of David, who found favor before God and asked to find a dwelling for the God of Jacob. But Solomon built him a house. However, the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands, as the prophet says, Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will you build for me, says the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Has my hand not made all these things? Stephen is now defending against the charge that he spoke against the temple. He will argue that God is not necessarily worshipped in one particular spot. The Old Testament worship occurred at the tabernacle when it was first established, and as the tabernacle moved around, the place of worship moved around too. The first place of worship was not the temple, nor would the temple be the last. The first place of worship was not Jerusalem, nor would it be contained to Jerusalem. It was in the wilderness as commanded by God on Mount Sinai, and you can read about that in Exodus 19 through 26, those chapters. The tabernacle was passed down to Joshua on through David, and then David asked God, you are deserving of something better. I want to build a dwelling place for you. And God said, no, you're not going to do that. If it was so important it needed to be done, He would have made sure it got done immediately. Because that's how God's will and His plan work. When it's time to be baptized, it's time to be baptized. It's not time to wait for another generation, to wait for your son to come along. And so Stephen knows all this, and he knows his audience knows all this. And so David had God's favor, yet he was not allowed to build the temple, and that was left for Solomon. So the temple was something God allowed, but did not need or require. Just like He allows certain things to happen, even though they're sinful, He's not going to stop all sin in the world. Sometimes He'll let things happen, even though they're maybe not the most wise thing, or really do the best for Him. And that was the idea behind the temple here, and that's what Stephen is trying to say. Solomon dedicated the temple in 1 Kings 8 and verse 27. He declares God can't be confined to any building. After he's built this for God, he actually says, this is not good enough for God. It's not big enough for God, and that's what Stephen is referencing in this defense. The universe is His seat, something far bigger than we even know how it exists, and we send astronauts out trying to understand more and more about it. He says that isn't even big enough to hold Him. And the earth, this giant thing that none of us will ever cover and see, is like a footstool. It's like a little peg to Him. The key takeaway here is that the temple is not God's dwelling place. And it wasn't some special place for the Sanhedrin. And they weren't special because man made them a special role. That was something that man created, not something that God created. We don't have any text to read here, but I think in most of your translations you'll see kind of some white text after verse 50, before verse 51 picks up, and that's intended to demonstrate a dramatic pause. And I think that's what's going on here. And I know I need to hurry, but I want to make the most of this. I want to make sure you really get what I want to share here. This is one of the things that I got most out of my study. So I want to focus on this moment. At this point, Stephen's provided a wonderful summary of God's plan. Frankly, it's much faster than what I've done up to this point. Complete summary of the history, the most relevant and important. Really fast, very brief, very clear, easy to understand, point by point. His defense, he could rest, I think, at this point. He's highlighted those who faithfully follow God and highlighted those who willfully disobey or rebel against Him. And I really think if Stephen had stopped here, he would have had an outcome like what we read in Acts chapter 5. He would have been beaten. He would have went home. He would have hugged his wife, would have hugged his kids, And I think that's what would have happened. I think Stephen stopped here and he kind of looked around. Started reflecting. And I can tell you, I know what he would have been thinking. And many of you probably do as well. As he looked at these council members in that semicircle. You remember that image we looked at a few minutes ago. And he would have contemplated what his next words needed to be, if anything. If anything. Reminds me of a scene in a movie. And it was kind of escalating. This probable confrontation between a lawyer and a more senior official. And it was leading up to that moment. His friends and those advisors and counselors around him kept cautioning him, be careful. Don't go too far. Be careful of the risk. You could risk it all. You could lose it all. And I think that's what Stephen was probably had experienced as well. Most people believe this was about a year after the day of Pentecost. And Stephen would have been building from what we read about in chapter 6. And his family, maybe even his wife, maybe his mom, if she were still alive. Stephen, be careful. Don't go too far. Make sure you know what you're doing. Make sure you know what you say and how you say it. Don't go too far. You know, Stephen might have even considered things that we can read about today, but he would have just known back then. In John chapter 12, it says in verse 42 and 43, nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in Jesus, but because of the Pharisees, they did not confess Jesus, lest they should be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. And so Stephen might have known that one of those men was right here. And he might have turned and just looked at him. And that man was probably like, you probably ought to stop. Because we kind of talked about this ahead of time. I know what's coming. Probably read in Acts chapter 5 and verse 41, so they, the apostles, departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. Would have been cool to walk out of there and I showed them. I really gave up my all. Told them all about Moses and Jacob, the temple, the tabernacle. And I'm not trying to put down Peter or John in Acts chapter 5. That's there for our learning and that was important. Might have even thought about what Luke wrote in chapter 9 of his gospel. He said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what profit is it a man if he gains the whole world and is himself destroyed or lost? And what Stephen decides is I've got to finish the message. And over there in chapter 6, where it talks about the establishment of deacons, there's a word there, I think in most English translations, it's boldly. It describes bravery, courage, boldness. And Stephen says, that's what I signed up for. And he keeps on. And so here Stephen lands his defense with a counter-accusation to the council. You're acting just like your fathers. Not the patriarchal fathers that we all look up to and we need to look up to. Our fathers, part of this message. The rebellious ancestors that you probably lift up. And not only that, you resist the Holy Spirit. That's that little voice inside you that tells you this way is right and this way is wrong. And you like to choose the wrong way. And the council are the ones blaspheming the God, Moses, the law, the temple or the tabernacle, the place of worship. And they're the ones who are persecuting the disciples of Christ. And of course, we see there in chapter 7, beginning with verse 51, he says, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute, and they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one? of whom you now have become the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it. When they heard these things, they were cut to the heart, and they gnashed at him with their teeth. But he, being full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God, and said, Look, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Then they cried out with a loud voice, stopped their ears, and ran at him with one accord, and they cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he knelt down and cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. Of course, he died. You know, what we find here is a crime of passion. Sanhedrin should have voted on anything that required a decision. We don't see that. We don't see that governance or pomp and circumstance and all that. We just see these people start to cover their ears, say, I don't want to hear any more about this, and gnashing, angry. We're going to get you. You weren't supposed to do this today. And they rushed him. It was a riot. And not only did these men not possess the privilege of instituting capital punishment, they didn't even follow their procedures to even make that decision. This was like an honor killing, and in the interest of time, I'll just say that that's a person who's acted in a manner that could damage a family name. Oftentimes in history, it's been a woman. The assumptions are generally based on feelings and perceptions rather than objective truth, and the intent is to restore honor. In some ways, these Sanhedrin thought they would restore honor. That's kind of messed up. And the image as is seen, they're dragging him out of this private temple room. I want you to think about that. They didn't do it in the private area. They drug him out. People would have been outside waiting, wondering, what's going on? Hoping that Stephen comes out. It's like, oh, I showed them, just like Peter and John. And they don't see any of that. They see a scene of confusion. These family and friends were probably anxiously awaiting and then disappointed when they see what's happening. The apostles maybe optimistically stood by. Maybe he got through. Maybe they changed. Curious Christians probably kind of stood at a distance. I wonder what's going on. Wonder what's going to happen. And really not knowing anything about what was said or anything, they just see him being drug out and killed. And now they've got to process that mob dragging him out. And of course he died. Luke's text here is carefully crafted for Stephen's family. It's carefully crafted for Christians needing inspiration today, even in very difficult decisions. And I hope that you never have a moment like Stephen. But I hope you have moments in your life. And I hope you respond the way Stephen did. Look for that moment. You know what the name means? The name means crown. Chapter 7 closes with Stephen receiving his crown. And Luke now shifts the spotlight to Saul, who's going to be the central figure throughout most of the rest of Acts. In Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 4, it says, Now Saul was consenting to his death. At that time, a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering every house and dragging off men and women, committing them to prison. Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere, preaching the word. Stephen's gotten his crown. You know, at the end of chapter 7, what you see there is he says that I see Jesus, and I see him standing. That's significant. Every time you see Jesus doing his work, he's sitting by God. I got to tell you, I don't know what it'll be like at my funeral. I won't be alive. And we do a lot of things to honor people, to show tribute. I think it'd be really cool if people were standing for me for some reason. Not asking you to do that. I'm just trying to help you kind of maybe relate to Stephen here a little bit. The Messiah, the Savior, said, look at him. I stand for him. And gave him a crown. And then there's this guy kind of monitoring things. Says he enjoys it. He approves it. Hey, give me your clothes so you can really get after it. So you can really throw those stones at him. Make sure you can really get him good. This is the man that Stephen's family is going to have to forgive. But what's great is he started this movement that the gospel wouldn't stay in the temple. It wouldn't stay in Jerusalem. It would go all around the world. And Saul would be a part of that. So in chapter 8, we'll see a bit about Philip, and then we will see a lot about Paul if you were to go and study the rest of Acts. I really appreciate the study questions. We could sit here and take a quiz and an exam. I think we covered all of these. Abraham gave the covenant of circumcision. Moses said, it was the Lord God who will raise up a prophet like me that needs to be heard. Temples made by man is not where God, the Most High, dwells. Stephen saw God's glory when he gazed into heaven. I moved over that pretty quickly. Stephen's final words were, Lord, don't charge them with this sin, following the example of Jesus. And Saul was the one consenting to Stephen's death, and Saul was the one who made havoc of the early church. That word havoc indicates he was like a wild animal going into these houses, killing women, killing kids, destroying homes and families and all that. What a great shift that he's going to make as Luke kind of shines a light on him and says, watch this guy. He's going to do some great things. Never want to close without offering the gospel invitation. If you stand ready to be believing in God and Jesus and repenting of sins, confessing Jesus before others, we'll baptize you. If you need the prayers of the church, we'll do that as well while we stand and sing this song of invitation.